Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Kianistan podcast. I'm very happy to say joining us today we have Tim Anderson. Tim is one of the finest and most hardworking analysts that I know of, and it's always a pleasure. I always listen to him wherever I find him online. Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Brilliant. Tim, let's start with what's going on in Iran. How do you see the current situation? Why have we got to this stage where after this June 12-day war, we're back to where we were then?
Yes, well, the situation remains very dangerous, of course. And at the moment, it seems that there's a standoff because there are these tensions between the Israelis and the Trump regime on the one hand. And on the other hand, the Iranian government has made its position very clear. It's not going to surrender its defense capabilities because the missile capacity of Iran has become the new big fear of the Israelis. That they're ignoring the nuclear issue to a large degree now. They are trying to demand that Trump somehow removes Iran's missile capability and stops the Iranians from providing support to the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance to defend themselves. Neither of those things are on the Iranian agenda. They're not going to comply with either of those. Similarly with the nuclear thing, which remains as a sort of a token, the idea of zero uranium enrichment has been repeated many times by the Iranians, but really it's become pretty clear that the Israelis, after the 12-day war and after the failure of their armed insurrection in January this year, because the Israelis ran that one basically and got Trump to nominally back it, after those failures, they are now quite worried that they're going to receive greater punishment from the Iranians if there is a direct strike on Iran. And apparently, I'm told, and it's been confirmed from a couple of sources, that the Trump administration already sent a message to Iran saying, what about we hit 2 sites and then it's all over and you can hit 2 sites, and the Iranians said, no, we don't accept that anymore because it's just going to repeat itself again and again. You will think we are weak and you can hit us at any time. And the Iranian message has been very clear. If you hit us even in a small demonstrative way, we are going to attack your assets in the whole Persian Gulf area and the Israelis as well. So in other words, there's a threat of escalation from the Iranians because they are sick of being a punching bag for the Israeli and for the U.S. sponsors, basically, and they're not going to accept. What Trump wants is some sort of symbolic strike where he can say that he won and he resolved things very quickly in and out without any casualties. That's what Trump is looking for. It's not possible here because he can't carry out regime change in Iran rapidly in a way that he might against a smaller country. And also the Israelis are not happy with the idea that Trump is going to back down on what they wanted from the U.S. administration. But at the moment, although Netanyahu is meeting Trump in the U.S. Later on today or Wednesday U.S. time, it seems that there's going to be some differences. And the question is how the Israeli pressure on Trump is going to play out, because, of course, there are very strong rumors that the Israelis still have this leverage on Trump through the Epstein files, for example, and if Trump doesn't go down the path they want, that they may try and put more pressure and embarrass Trump, and that may create a greater rift between the Israelis and Trump, although it's difficult to see how Trump has any real autonomy these days since the huge Israeli donors have effectively purchased him.
Yes, so it seems like it's not a coincidence, the timing of these files, Epstein files that have come out. Do you think it has something to do with this pressure that's being applied on Trump for Iran?
Well, Trump has been resisting it because obviously he's one of the main figures who is linked into Epstein historically, despite his false denials. He maintained a relationship for a very long time with Epstein, including after Epstein was convicted back in, I think, 2008, 2009. as many other people did. Basically, Epstein had infiltrated most of the senior levels of the Anglo-American regime, the Anglo-American empire, let's say the British and the Americans, and of course the Israelis, working very closely with the Israelis. We know from the Epstein files that Epstein himself, and perhaps even more Ghislaine Maxwell, was a serious Israeli racist, didn't really like the idea of Goyim, non-Jewish people, except when they were serving Jewish people. So there was a very strong Jewish supremacist line that's come out of the most recent release of Epstein files, basically. Now, Trump has tried to block this and play it down and censor it, bluster his way through it, basically, because he still fears some greater embarrassment may be yet to come. And it may be that the Israelis still have some revelations up their sleeves. So that's part of the pressure that the Israelis can exert over Trump now. In terms of the timing, of course, it was a separate series of events in the U.S. because the Congress had pushed for a release, and then the Trump administration had blocked it, and then the Congress insisted, and now it's in bits and pieces being redacted and censored and so on, slowly coming out. So that the timeline has been affected by the resistance, let's say, by the Trump administration and the insistence on the part of the Congress to forge ahead with that. So it's got its own party political implications in the US.
Sure. This situation, negotiations, is an extraordinary kind of stance to have with Iran, that either we bomb you or you give away all of your weapons, your missiles, your nuclear program, stand there naked, and then we'll kind of take you out anyway.
Yeah, it's not very persuasive, is it? Trump, that's for some sort of deal for his image. He's driven by this notion of self-image. But as you say, it's not persuasive to anyone. So give up all your weapons or we'll bomb you. And if you give up your weapons, we'll bomb you anyway, basically. So what's in it for? Like the nuclear deal, there was nothing in it for the Iranians, really, but except that they have agreed to talk again because diplomatically, there's always some diplomatic reason if it's the appearances to your constituency that wants you to exhaust all avenues before there is some serious conflict. I think that every state has to consider that. They can't say except maybe Yemen. The Yemenis, they don't bother with this, but most states try and demonstrate that they've carried out all reasonable options to avoid conflict before conflict actually occurs. And I think that there's a level of diplomacy that's still there in the Iranian government, which they are trying to, even though they don't talk directly to the US, and even though there's nothing really substantial to talk about in the way that the Trump administration has framed it, still the Iranians are saying, we are prepared to talk. I think they've even made some concessions about reducing the level of enrichment of their uranium, for example. Certainly not zero enrichment. But as I said, the Israelis are now obsessed with Iran's missile capability, having been hit once, and Trump actually saved them at that time at the end of the 12-day war by his bombing of the sites and claiming that he'd destroyed the whole nuclear industry, which of course was false. But anyway, it's a position that he maintains to this day. I might point out, by the way, that a recent revelation from a number of sources is that the Iranians have now got a Chinese, it's called third dimensional radar for stealth aircraft, a very advanced system, which is apparently effective against the bombers that we used back in the 12-day war, the ones that came from Diego Garcia to bomb Iran. So the Iranians have been improving their technology since June last year. They developed a new hypersonic missile, which is even more difficult to stop. So the air defenses apparently had been boosted with Chinese technology as well as the native Iranian technology. So the Iranians have been preparing themselves for a much larger scale war, and the Israelis also, but the Israelis are worried that they can't stop this massive arsenal of missiles that the Iranians have, and that's why they are very desperate, and that's why Netanyahu is going later on today to see Trump and try and insist that Trump pushes the missile issue even ahead of the nuclear issue in the current round of so-called negotiations.
Yes, apparently Israel tried to send a message to Iran saying that if there is an attack, it's got nothing to do with us. That's between you and USA. So please don't come and attack us. And Iran said, absolutely not. Any attack on us, and we're going to retaliate full scale on both America and Israel.
I heard that came from the US side, basically, that the US had said, what about we do a couple of symbolic strikes and then fall over, and you can do a couple of symbolic strikes too. You know, in the past, the Iranians have actually agreed to that, basically, you know, that when they hit US air bases in Al Udeid in Qatar and Ain al-Arab and Iraq, they warned the US. The US got its personnel out there. There were no serious US casualties from those counter strikes. But the Iranians are saying that's not going to happen this time. We're fed up, and you're just going to keep taking advantage of us if we agree to these types of symbolic attacks, basically. And remember, over 1,000 Iranian people were, many of them civilians, were killed in the 12-day war back in last year. You know, so it's not that the Iranians aren't suffering seriously from these attacks. I mean, some military people, some leadership, but also ordinary people. I was in Iran a few months ago and I visited some of the sites there. You know, every time they murder a scientist, they murder his family, they murder his neighbor, they destroy the whole building. So Iran has said, we're not going to accept this anymore.
You're absolutely right. Iran's taken a lot of precautions in strengthening its air defenses, its missile capabilities were already very strong. But I think one of the big things now also is that how in this unrest that happened recently, Iran was able to identify and take out a lot of informers and a lot of these kind of spies within Iranian society. And I think that and the fact that they have such a strong hold on the internet, the
Starlink.
That's it. They were able to control that completely. I think these things together have made it very difficult for America and Israel to know exactly what's going on inside Iran.
Well, the Iranians took down Starlink, which the US didn't think they could do it, but they did. But before they did it, they took down the rest of the internet because the internet was used to coordinate the terrorist attacks that were going on particularly over the nights of the 8th and the 9th of January last month. Once they took that down, those that had a Starlink connection that wasn't linked to the main Iranian internet connection showed up, and they were able to go around and round up the people that had Starlink terminals, because the only people that had Starlink terminals were those outside funded groups that were involved in organizing these. It wasn't unrest or protest. It was deliberate terrorist type attacks. The Iranians called it rioters. But anyway, they were violent. They were armed. They were a body of people that were specifically developed over many years by the Israelis, many of them Afghan refugees, some Indians apparently, but some Iranians too. And they were an asset on the ground for the Israelis, not really for regime change, but to create some type of chaos and disruption within which they'd hoped that regime change might take place. And then Israeli and U.S. strikes might somehow soften up the government so that they could move into a regime change possibility. We know now, all of the sides know now, that's not going to happen. There's no real imminent prospect of regime change unless there was a huge ground invasion, and the US is not ready for that. Trump is not ready for it. Trump doesn't even have the capacity for it. He doesn't have the type of troops that the US had when they invaded Iraq, and in any case, Iran is a much bigger country and better defended than Iraq. So they've relied on proxies the whole time. You notice, by the way, they are moving some of their ISIS prisoners from Syria across to Iraq because they're concerned now that Iraq may be redeveloping some independent political will there with the return of Nouri al-Maliki to the prime ministership there. So the US has been beginning to withdraw some of its troops from Iraq, but it's positioning some of its proxy forces. And ISIS has always been a proxy force for the US in that entire region, including against Iran, particularly against Iran, on the Baluchi side of Iran, for example. So there's no possibility of a ground invasion. Trump is very averse to casualties. They can't do regime change by simply bombing or missile strikes. Iran is going to defend itself much more vigorously this time, even than it did in June. And June was sufficient to scare the Israelis because the Iranians did a lot of damage to some of the military and industrial infrastructure in Israel back then. I think only perhaps a couple of dozen people were killed in Israel compared to over 1,000 in Iran. But nevertheless, the Iranian forces were prevailing in the last few days of that 12-day war, and that's why Trump saved them. And so the Israelis are very concerned now that if a new round of bombing starts, that they're going to get hit again, and they are very worried about the Iranian missile arsenal, and that's why Netanyahu is putting pressure on Trump to try and use his influence. I don't think it's going to work at all, but to try and use his influence to get the Iranians to give up their main deterrent force.
It is amazing. I still don't understand the thought process of what's going on from Israel and American point of view. There's very limited options that they have with Iran at the moment. They, as you said, they can't really do regime change without having boots on ground, huge forces, many times bigger than what they needed in Iraq, and that's not going to happen. They can't really do a repeat of what they did in Venezuela. So other than that, it's very difficult to see what they can actually achieve with strikes. But they've put themselves in this situation where they have to do something. But if they do something, then the risk of that is that it could actually trigger the end of the American empire. So I don't understand the balance between the risk and the reward. How are they weighing this out? With this in mind, I just don't see how they have any options at the moment other than just coming to the table.
But Tafim, you're a rational person. You're thinking rationally about these sorts of things. There's one analyst, I saw an African analyst recently, his name escapes me at the moment, who was saying that it's likely there's going to be a conflict because the US doesn't know how to talk respectfully to other parties with some sort of mutual gain out of it. Yeah, they're not reasonable people, or the Trump regime, but also the US and the deep state generally. And in my view, the Israelis are simply part of that US deep state, basically. They've inveigled their way into the US deep state. And they have a say about these sorts of things, and they have influence, through the Epstein system, of course, but also through the fact that the US financial system has very strong Zionists in it. And we should say the financial and media oligarchy in the US basically has very strong, committed Zionists in there, basically. Somehow they believe that the future of the US empire, certainly in West Asia, depends on the presence of the Israelis. And if there's a chance that Israel as a colony is going to collapse, that's certainly going to be the end of the US empire in West Asia. I don't say in the whole world, but certainly in West Asia. If the Israeli regime goes down, US influence in the Arab and Muslim world goes down too. There's no doubt about that. In the meantime, really, the problem is apparently there are these emerging contradictions between the Israelis and the Trump administration. First of all, Trump has his son-in-law, Kushner, and some others talking about having some sort of casino Riviera development in Gaza. And the Israelis are not really down with that. They want to move ahead with their original recolonization plan, basically. So they're not exactly seeing eye to eye in the way that they tried to steal the Palestinian territory, basically. So and how they do it. And similarly with the objectives with Iran now, the Israelis their expectations are very high. Their paranoia is very high. They've always been very paranoid that someone in the US system is going to betray them, not support them at a critical moment. That's been there for a very, very long time. Although people claim that the Israelis control the US, they have enormous influence through their role in the US deep state, but they are still always paranoid that someone is not going to back them up at the last moment. You might, in a parallel there, you might remember, for example, that remember when the Georgian president, I think in 2008, started the conflict with Russia and then expected that George W. Bush was going to come in and help him, and he didn't. So there are people who I think they're very loyal allies to the US, but it doesn't always work. The logic doesn't always work that way. So the Israelis are always looking. They've been the most active spy force within the US itself. even though and in my view, they're part of the deep state, but nevertheless, they're always trying to see if there's going to be some movement in the US elite that may let them down. At the moment, they really want their ambition, their expectations are very high, their paranoia is very high. They know that their project is hated around the world, that people all around the world hate them now, the Western world as well as the global South. We know that they're despised around the world, they're pariahs. Even some of the European states are being pushed by their populations into breaking ties. So Israelis are in a paranoid, rather desperate situation. They want Trump to save them. And Trump has been their best bet, really, in a sense. He's green-lit the aggression that they've done all around the region in the last year or two, extraordinary attacks, from attacking Iran directly, invading South Syria, constantly attacking Lebanon, carrying out more ethnic cleansing on the West Bank, the genocidal massacres in Gaza, attacking the flotilla people in international waters and Tunisian waters. There's attacking the Yemenis. There's been an extraordinary proliferation of aggression, partly sort of facilitated, or largely facilitated, by the fact that they believe that while Trump is there, they can do whatever they want, basically, even if the world hates them. And they're still trying to rehabilitate their soft power, which is a hopeless cause now, but they are still carrying out these types of propaganda wars. Like in my own country, we have a very compliant Labor government, which invited the Israeli president here, and that catalyzed huge protests. And in the end, some violent police response to try and repress the protests. So the Israelis are still trying to shut down dissent and protest and criticism. They've done it in the universities in my country. They've effectively banned any discussion of Gaza in Australian universities. I think that they've tried that across the Anglo-speaking world, basically. So they're still concerned about their soft power, but they've lost that comprehensively now. But they are worried about being crushed by a second Iranian retaliation if they attack Iran. But nevertheless, they have committed themselves very openly to this idea of trying to unilaterally disarm Iran, which has always been their major enemy in the region and is still, to this day, helping rebuild the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance so that they can defend themselves against this very toxic colony.
Yeah. Apparently, I think, first of all, you're right. For Israel, the kind of biggest champion in a way is Trump. But also, I think, because of his unpredictable nature, probably the paranoia you're talking about would probably be keeping them up as well, because you never know with Trump what he might do on any given day, even though he's always been pretty loyal to Israel. But you never know. But apparently, Israel is pushing not just for a regime change in Iran, but balkanization of Iran, so that Balochistan gets split up, the Kurdish areas get split up, the Azeris, which obviously isn't going to happen unless we have ground troops. So I think what he's asking for is something simply Trump cannot deliver.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They want the destruction of Iran as a coherent, independent state. Same with Syria, same with Iraq. And also they like the idea, not that they care about the Baluchis or the Kurds or anything, but like the idea of an ethnic mini states. It tends to normalize the Jewish colony in the region, basically. And indeed, they've spoken of the Kurdistan state within the Iraqi Federation as a second Israel, basically. So they like that idea because it normalizes their position. And of course, it's really very consistent with the US strategy, which has been divide and rule for a very long time. Every empire has carried this out. The Romans carried it out. The British realized in India that they had to divide people on the basis of religion. And so the partition of Pakistan and India and so on. The US has carried through very consistently in the West Asian region. And that's why they've used agents like the Saudis and the Takfiri Wahhabi ideology to try and divide, successfully and for periods of time in certain areas, to divide Muslims from Muslims. And of course, we know that the terrorist groups that they created through the Saudis and through some of the other Persian Gulf Arab monarchies, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and so on, were precisely based on this sectarian ideology. And then the result of which was those Al-Qaeda, ISIS groups mainly murdered Muslims, and mainly Sunni Muslims, even though their ideology was aimed at Shia. But that was their successful tactic, and that's, of course, ISIS itself was created because they feared that Baghdad, after the fall of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath government in Iraq, they feared that a Shia-dominant government in Iraq would get closer to Tehran, and indeed that was true, basically. And so ISIS was created precisely for that reason, as Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State in Iraq. And then it was ported across to Syria to help with that eventually successful attempt to destroy a genuine nationalist pluralist government in Damascus, which was supporting the Lebanese and the Palestinian resistance. So they carry on with the same strategy there of trying to divide and rule people. And of course, they would want Iran, like China, like Russia, they would like them fragmented little enclaves, a Uyghur state and God knows what in China and Russia. They resent the fact that Russia is such a big country with so many resources. They would like to carve that up if they could, but this is just their, imperial dreams at a time of hegemonic decline. The Anglo-American Empire is clearly declining economically. It's no longer the center of technological innovation or production or commerce, but it's very dangerous at this time.
It's very dangerous, yeah.
They dominate finance. They dominate propaganda. They're much better at propaganda than independent states. They're better coordinated. They use the dollar as a weapon against people now. And of course, that's why BRICS has been important in trying to undermine that weapon that's used against most of the world, basically. So they are dangerous in what I call the wars of hegemonic decline.
You're right. Israel is obsessed in trying to break up every country around it, whether it is Syria or Yemen, Sudan, Libya. Even in Pakistan, the unrest happening in Balochistan, a lot of the trail goes back to India and then Israel. But it's very interesting as well, I find, this rift is causing between UAE and Saudi Arabia, especially after what happened in Yemen. How do you see that?
Yes, well, the Saudis, of course, have always seen themselves as the natural rulers of the whole Arabian Peninsula, basically. And you know that they had this very, a vicious spat with the Qataris back in 2017. Interestingly, the Qataris got a lot of support from Iran at that time, even though Qatar and its very successful media agency, Al Jazeera, were promoting a very vicious anti-Shia sectarian line there. Some of the Syrian exile people were calling for genocide of minorities in Syria at the time. But nevertheless, it was Iran that saved Qatar at that time when the Saudis tried to cut off their airspace and so on. Now something similar is happening with the Emiratis, who are working closer with the Saudis in all of these dirty wars in the region. But because the Emiratis have a more openly pro-Israel policy, and they work directly with the Israelis on a number of projects in North Africa and in West Asia, I believe the Saudis got very jealous of their role in Yemen, for example. In Yemen, the so-called internationally recognized government, which is a group of exiles sitting in Riyadh in hotels, which not yet hosted by the Saudis, after they lost the war with the revolutionary government in Yemen. Everyone calls them Houthi rebels, which is it's disrespectful and it's false. Really, there's been a revolutionary government there for almost 12 years now. But only one state in the world so far, Iran, recognizes the revolutionary government in Sana'a. They have controlled, I've just produced a book, by the way, on Yemen, which is available now, at least in digital form, called
Brilliant.
Understanding Yemen. Yes, I'll send you the link to it soon. I'll send you a copy.
Yeah, please.
But they have controlled for over a decade at least 75% of the populated parts of Yemen, ignoring the map, which includes all the desert areas and so on. But the Saudis, back then, the so-called internationally recognized government, a number of Al-Qaeda type groups in Marib and western parts of Yemen close to, the eastern parts of Yemen close to Saudi Arabia. And the Emiratis were helping them by supporting this older successionist group called the Southern Transitional Council. And more recently, because the Yemenis were doing these operations with the Israelis, for example, the Israelis and the Yemenis and the Israelis and the Emiratis were selling tourist packages to Socotra Island. Socotra Island is a very unique World Heritage listed island off the south coast of Yemen, a beautiful area. And the Israelis and the Emiratis were selling it as tourist packages to Western people. They, at the same time, they were also engaged in supporting this vicious sectarian group, the RSF in Sudan, carrying out terrible massacres in Sudan, trying to get a beachhead for the Israelis in the Horn of Africa. The Israelis were the only state to preemptively recognize a state of Somaliland, which is really a region in Somalia, which is not recognized by anyone except the Israelis, because the Israelis wanted a naval base there. So in Sudan, in Somalia, which are very close to Yemen, and of course at that Bab al-Mandab entrance to the Red Sea, which has been strategically important, of which the Yemeni revolutionary government has been staking out to try and prevent supply to the genocidal regime in occupied Palestine. The number of projects that the Israelis and the Emiratis were doing together was seen as a threat by the Saudis. They don't really appreciate the rise of this little pipsqueak emirate in the Persian Gulf to counter their influence in the GCC and in the region, basically. So they came in and bombed a supply of weapons to the Emirati forces that were based in South Yemen, particularly one of the ports that was close to Marib, which is an area that the Saudi proxies control. Marib is divided. The revolutionary government controls part of it, and the Saudi proxies another part. But the Saudis saw the Emirati groups, the STC, which they would now call secessionists, working against the internationally recognized government based in Riyadh of Yemen. So they moved against the Emirati forces, and the Emiratis very quickly surrendered. Within a couple of days, they withdrew completely from Yemen. Their position was taken over by the Saudis. I don't know exactly how the Saudi relationship with the Southern Transitional Council is working now, but I did speak to a very senior Yemeni official in Sana'a, and he says, look, the situation hasn't changed at all. The Saudis are always the senior Arab enemy, basically, in the region, so far as Yemen is concerned. That they have filled the gap left by the Emiratis when the Emiratis left. I think the Saudis were evacuating Western tourists from Socotra Island, for example. I don't know. I believe that business has probably fallen into abeyance for a while until the Saudis work out what to do with it. But the Emiratis have, under pressure, of course, they under bombing by the Saudis, they in that southern port, they withdrew from Yemen. But the occupation relationship is similar. It's just that it's probably weakened the occupation by Saudi proxy forces and demoralized the so-called Southern Transitional Council, which has control of Aden, the port of Aden, and some of the southern coastal areas there. So this is another. It's very similar in my mind to the Saudi attack on the Qataris in 2017. That the Saudis are really saying, look, all of you upstart Arab sheikhs from the Persian Gulf, you're part of our region and you should comply with us, basically. And of course, that was the case also in Bahrain. If you recall, the democracy movement in Bahrain was only crushed because the Bahraini regime there, and the population is majority Shia. It used to be part of Iran, really. The former Shah of Iran gave it away to a separate regime there. But it was the Saudi forces that came in across a peninsula to Bahrain to put down the democracy movement in Bahrain back in 2011. So the Saudis have reasserted themselves. They've kicked the Emiratis out of Yemen. The situation remains the same. There's a revolutionary government in Sana'a. No one in the world recognized them except the Islamic Republic of Iran. For a brief time, the Assad government in Syria recognized them. But even before the Assad government was toppled, Assad pulled back from the support for the Ansar-led government because he was trying to curry favor and get some investment from the Arab League and the Saudis and the Emiratis, which never materialized.
It just seems like everywhere there's some problem, somehow UAE is somewhere behind it. And they kind of tend to see ports or some local unrest, and they tend to start funding that and start creating a bigger. And I think they're trying to create a whole kind of a chain of ports around the world. I was listening to someone, I think it was Andreas Krieg from King's College London, who talks about UAE and his Saudi Arabia conflict quite a lot. And I was surprised because he was saying even that the attacks from Saudi Arabia on Qatar were basically instigated by UAE, because it was actually UAE which was more opposed to Qatar even than Saudi Arabia, simply because they're terrified of political Islam. But it's quite amazing how such a small country, I mean, especially messing around in Yemen, all they would need is probably a couple of missiles to come through from Ansar al-Islam, and that will be the end of the business in UAE. So I'm not sure it seems like they're biting off more than they can chew. Now I think they're kind of annoying Turkey as well in the process.
Yes, well, I mean, a large part of the hostility to the Qataris, 9 years ago was, but they have been for quite a long time, part of this Muslim Brotherhood network, which Mr. Erdogan in Turkey represents, basically. And the Saudis were jealous of that too, because you saw it really reflected in Syria, because the armed groups that were supported by the different Arab monarchies in the Persian Gulf reflected the differences between those monarchies, basically. So each of them would support different armed groups. But the Saudis were jealous of the Muslim Brotherhood because it wasn't under their control, basically. They worked together with them at different times. They were jealous of Al Jazeera because it was much more effective than their media. They developed Al Arabiya, but Al Arabiya never had the reach of Al Jazeera, basically. So they were jealous of the Muslim Brotherhood influence, basically, even though the sectarianism of the Muslim Brotherhood parallels that of Wahhabism. But Wahhabism was always a cult linked to the Saudi monarchy, basically. So it didn't really have even the same ideological sort of roots as Takfirism or Salafism or even Deobandism in South Asia, which has its own traditions and sectarian traditions which seem to parallel Wahhabism. But Wahhabism was also a tool of the Saudi monarchy. So Saudi, and of course, you're right, the Emiratis were very clever in a way. They don't really have a strong basis in culture, in the Emirates in Dubai has no great history, unlike some other parts of the Persian Gulf. Yeah. But nevertheless, they've been enterprising to diversify away from their reliance on oil into their very successful airline. Qatar has paralleled that in a way, but also other financial operations. And then they were the lead Arab regime, if you like, that spearheaded this so-called Abraham Accords to normalize openly and work directly with the Israelis, because virtually all of the other Arab regimes cooperate with the Israelis indirectly, but the Emiratis tried to make a virtue of that, and hence these cooperations with the Israelis in North Africa as well as on the Arabian Peninsula. So I think there's a fair degree of Saudi jealousy at that type of those initiatives by the Emiratis.
How do you see this kind of defense agreement that kind of took place between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to start with, and now it seems like Turkey wants to join in as well? Because on one hand, it seems like not only Iran is not uncomfortable with it, but it seems like they're quite positive about it. And I think from a Pakistani point of view, in an ideal world, they would wanted Iran to join as well, but under US pressure, that's just not going to be possible. But behind the scenes, on one hand, it seems like for both Pakistan and Turkey, it seems like they want to avoid another conflict in Iran simply for their own selfish reasons as well, because Pakistan doesn't want unrest in their own Balochistan and Turkey doesn't want unrest in the Kurdish areas. And Saudi Arabia seems to have patched up a lot of kind of the differences that they had with Iran. But at the same time, I think it was you also shared a link from Saudi defense ministers in some private meeting telling the Americans that if America doesn't attack Iran, then that's only going to embolden Iran. So how do you see like which side of this whole narrative that's building up from Saudi Arabia, Turkey is the real one, and what's happening behind the scenes?
Well, it's difficult. You've mentioned a lot of countries there. The Saudis, of course, have this historical jealousy with Iran. It's not really the Saudis are on a parity with Iran because Iran is a very deep civilization and it has developed itself and the Western people don't really understand this very well, but the level of investment in education and training and industry in Iran since the revolution has been dramatic. You know, the level of illiteracy in Iran under the Shah was terrible. And of course, high levels of illiteracy really are a huge obstacle to development. So there is this underlying Saudi jealousy of Iran in the region, basically, and the sectarian roots, the anti-Shia sectarianism from Saudi Wahhabism has not gone away. But nevertheless, China managed to broker, and this was after some efforts by Iraq, managed to broker this type of reconciliation between Iran and Saudis, which was quite important. You know, it led to a number of practical things, including the brief reincorporation of Syria into the Arab League. It led to some cooperation with Iran and Saudi Arabia, but there still is that underlying sectarian difference from the part of the Saudis, not reciprocated in that way by the Iranians, because the Iranians have not promoted a sectarian Shia narrative in the region, contrary to the imperial propaganda. You know, the main sin of the Iranian government, according to the Western regimes, has been its support for the Palestinian resistance, which is mainly Sunni Muslim.
Yeah.
So, although organized on under different bases. So, the reconciliation, which the late national hero of Iran, Soleimani, was driving between Iran and Saudi was important. It also meant that although the Syrian government in Damascus ultimately fell to sectarian militia that had been supported by the Arab monarchies, in the final years, the Saudis themselves were not funding those militia, but Qatar was. Qatar and Turkey were. So Qatar and Turkey were both deeply involved, Qatar on the financial side in supporting those sorts of militia. Of course, none of those militia nor Muslim Brotherhood groups are tolerated within Saudi Arabia or the Emirates themselves. Basically, they're banned because they fear that type of backlash, internal backlash there. I think from an Iranian point of view, and they're much better diplomats than the Arab monarchies, they had always seen the benefits of good relations both with Turkey and despite the role that Turkey played in Syria, and with the Saudis, despite the role that the Saudis have played in the region, mainly through being an agent or a tool of the Anglo-Americans. You know, the Saudis were first a tool of the British Empire, and then they got passed over in the 50s to the North Americans, basically. So that's the main problem of the Saudis. I mean, sectarianism is one thing, but being a tool of the North Americans is another. Nevertheless, the Saudis and the Emiratis were invited into BRICS, notice, because the game that the Russians and the Chinese are playing is not a narrow game. They want to have a broader cooperation, basically, including with U.S. allies, as well as those that are besieged by the U.S., like Iran, for example. So that's how you explain, I suppose, that although the Saudis didn't join BRICS after the invitation, the Emiratis did. And to this day, the Russians have very good relationships with the Emiratis, basically, because they have a bigger picture of having this idea of having good relations, strategic relations with formal allies of the U.S., like Turkey, which is part of NATO, and the Emiratis, basically. So I think from the Iranian point of view, they had certainly promoted the idea of having very good fraternal relationships with other Muslim countries like Pakistan and Indonesia and Turkey, for example. And they've always promoted that, even to the point of ignoring some of the sectarian rhetoric that has come from, Qatar and Turkey, for example. So when you have this defense agreement between Pakistan and Saudi, you don't see much pushback from Iran, basically, because they're trying to maintain a decent diplomatic relationship. Similarly with Turkey, basically, and similarly from Turkey, neither Turkey nor Pakistan want to see an attack on Iran, basically, but they are internally compromised, as you pointed out to start with. Yeah. In the case of Pakistan, for example, you've got the same sort of thing arising with the Trump's so-called peace plan in Gaza, basically, that he would like to have Arab and Muslim countries involved in policing, the dispossession of the Palestinian people of Gaza. But even the most conservative or reactionary Arab and Muslim countries have some hesitation about that. Indonesia does not want to be involved. Malaysia certainly doesn't want to be involved. I don't think Pakistan wants to be involved in this Gaza operation. They see that it's against the Palestinian people. And for all of their weaknesses, all of their compromises, I think some of them, like Indonesia and Pakistan, they don't want to be used as tools against the Palestinian people. So now you might have some other options like Jordan and Morocco, for example, which are far more compromised. But these, there's something important about the fact that Muslim countries, Muslim-led countries, have some limits to the level to which they're going to be compromised. I mean, I think Malaysia is actually one of the better examples, really. Malaysia has taken a very principled stance in support of the Palestinian people. And but say, as you say, even Pakistan and Turkey, they don't want to be tools to be used against Iran, because Iran is a big neighboring country, and the instability that would create would be damaging for them, not just from the point of view of Baluchis who are or Kurds that are being purchased. And it seems like Mr. Erdogan has got his own Kurdish separatist problem more or less under control, which has had implications, of course, for those elsewhere. But the problem is that the Kurdish state in North Iraq has long been a base for the now defunct movement in Syria, but the still active Kurdish separatist front against Iran, basically. So because the CIA and Mossad are well based in Erbil, they have been based there for some time. This is the unfortunate consequence of Iraq being federalized, being partitioned, being weakened. Even though the occupation forces are being withdrawn, the U.S. is still controlling the oil finances of Iraq, and now the U.S. is moving thousands of ISIS prisoners into Iraq, and we can only assume the worst, that they're there as a potential asset to be used against Iraq and against Iran, of course, because ISIS is part of the mobilization in the Baluchi areas of Iran and Pakistan being used against Iran. So it's probably a reserve against the resurgence of independent political will in Baghdad, but it's also the ISIS assets being moved into Iraq are likely, particularly the commanders. They don't really care so much about the foot soldiers, but there's a fair deal of investment in the training of ISIS commanders that they can use for their latest project. And their latest project is Iran, of course.
Tim, in addition to West Asia, you also have a lot of expertise in Latin America. How do you see, first of all, what happened in Venezuela in terms of like the long-term impact of what that might cause in Venezuela, but also how do you see the current kind of pressures being applied on Cuba? And do you think Cuba is going to be able to resist all of that? And will Russia be able to help as well?
Look, the problem with Venezuela is that it's still not entirely clear what happened and what degree of control the Trump administration has over Venezuelan oil. We know that Venezuelan oil is being sold or resold by the U.S., and that includes some to the Israelis, but that's not directly from Venezuela. It's happening through U.S. companies which are on-selling oil Despite a recent story to the contrary, there's not a direct link being established by the Venezuelan government and the Israelis. It's happening directly through U.S. companies, because they are on selling this stuff. They have clearly disrupted the sending of Venezuelan oil to China, which was repayment for credit that China had afforded to Venezuela for many of its infrastructure projects, for example. So they've broken that link to a degree. I believe they've allowed some on-selling of oil to India for the same sort of reasons. India had provided some credit to Venezuela in exchange for that debt being repaid by oil shipments, basically. But what we don't know yet, because and there's good reason to be skeptical about what the transitional Venezuelan government is saying, but also what the Trump administration is saying. The Trump administration is saying we now run Venezuela, even though we don't occupy it, even though we didn't send any troops in, because we can coerce the government there now. The government led by acting President Delcy Rodriguez is saying, no, actually, our policies haven't changed at all, and we are now getting more revenue from oil sales, which was previously blocked, to fund the projects that we want to fund, like the communal councils and so on. So there may be some reason to be skeptical about what Caracas is saying about that, because they're trying to put a good face on what's been a very humiliating experience for them, and certainly they are acting under the coercion of the U.S. But it's not totally clear to me to what extent that coercion is actually working. In other words, the U.S. is saying the funds are being held offshore by some company in the Middle East, and the U.S. will decide where it goes. And the Venezuelan president said, Delcy Rodriguez said that, no, we got $300 million from this latest tranche of oil sales, and here it's being spent on these projects. So it's a little bit unclear to what extent the remote control U.S. coercive control of Venezuela is actually working. They are now selling Venezuelan oil and allowing U.S. companies in, which was happening under Maduro. If you recall, there was a agreement between the Biden administration and Maduro nutted out in Mexico, which involved some exchange of prisoners, including some of the U.S. mercenaries who tried a coup under the first Trump regime, a hopeless failed coup. And they were exchanged for a number of Venezuelan citizens, undocumented migrants, who were sent to these ultra-high security jails in El Salvador, basically. So, and in exchange for that, that big U.S. company, what's it called, Chevron or Exxon, I always mix up the two, was allowed to do extraction in the Orinoco Belt. So, in other words, the Maduro government was already open to some level of normalization with the U.S., including allowing some U.S. extraction and certainly sale to the U.S., which had been going on for a long time. Chavez was selling oil to the U.S. for a very long time. Yeah. But then until the U.S. began to steal Venezuelan assets. So the level of control, to me, is not entirely clear. Obviously, it's a serious incursion into the sovereignty of Venezuela. But there have been some aspects, such as the removing the blockade on the sale of Venezuelan oil, which is being used to the advantage of Venezuela. The extent to which that's happening is not entirely clear yet. Nevertheless, overall, it's a very damaging blow to a Latin American country's sovereignty, and it certainly has implications for other countries, in particular Cuba. And now you will have seen that with Cuba, that the blockade on Cuba, which is now 64 years old, without ceasing, begun under President John F. Kennedy in 1962. That blockade has been tightened by Trump a couple of times under his first administration. You remember actually the Obama administration before Trump had actually slightly loosened that blockade and recognized diplomatically Cuba. Now, still to this day, there are still some formal relations as opposed to indirect relations. But the major step that Trump has taken with Cuba is to block Venezuelan oil, but also oil from any other country he uses this tool of tariffs that he's announced against many, many countries to impose 25% tariffs on everything from a country that sends any oil to Cuba, basically. And that seems to have effectively stopped the Mexican government, which was sending oil to Cuba after the failure of Venezuelan supplies. It stopped the Mexican government sending oil to Cuba. But nevertheless, Mexico has stepped in, and China has stepped in, and Russia has stepped in with humanitarian supplies for Cuba. So there have been Russian supplies to Cuba. There was recently a Mexican naval boat which took 800 tons of humanitarian supplies there. They still have the serious problem with fuel in Cuba, to some extent being alleviated by the fact that the Chinese in recent years have been developing a very big solar energy network there, but it doesn't help with all transport in Cuba. It helps with power to a degree. So the Cubans have been resisting and surviving this siege for longer than most Cubans have been alive, basically, longer than most people on Earth have been alive, 64 years. Nevertheless, the fuel blockade is a very serious blow and a very cynical blow, because it's nothing to do with political or government actions. It's meant to make the people suffer. And they said this, we know from historical records. They said it about Cuba. They said it about Chile in the 70s. They said it about Iran more recently. They want the people to suffer and starve and get desperate and overthrow their own government. That's always been the modus operandi of U.S. blockades, and the Trump is just in a long line of continuity from John F. Kennedy in the early 60s. That was the motive then. It's trying. Remember, Pompeo said about Iran, if they want to eat at one stage under Trump's first administration, if they want to eat, they'll comply with what we want them to do, basically. So the U.S. has always said this about its economic blockades, and they're part of hybrid war these days. In fact, the hybrid war, the economic blockades are far greater now than they have ever been. Again, as I say, consistent with the historical period we're in, where the U.S. is in this long terminal decline as the economic dominant player in the world, and these wars of hegemonic decline are really attempts to try and allow it to hold on to what influence it used to have, basically. But it's not always working the way that they want it. So Cuba is under a lot of pressure. They have huge experience in resisting, but they're going through very hard times now. They have very consistent support from Mexican government, although the Mexican government's not invulnerable to the pressures from the U.S. Of course, most of 80% of Mexico's trades with the U.S., so it was certainly a serious intimidation to them to have 25% tariffs on everything. The Chinese have managed to resist that to a greater degree. Of course, the Russians and the Iranians, already under very severe economic coercive measures, are less affected by that. And that's, of course, what's happening with BRICS. The more you have countries that are under economic siege themselves, the less affected they are by the dictatorship of the dollar and the economic siege measures that use the dollar, basically. So, of course, in the long term, Cuba is an associate member of BRICS. Cuba hopes for some relief from this siege through a new financial architecture, or at least bilateral swaps in terms of finance and trade there. Mexico is providing humanitarian support. China is, Russia is, but it's the Cuban people who are resisting this sort of pressure. We know that the U.S. has other countries in its sights. We know it has Nicaragua, because Nicaragua has been a resistant group, and the foresight of the former Iranian president Raisi, he made an agreement with Nicaragua, which is very small, doesn't have much economic weight, but he made a strategic agreement between Iran and Nicaragua some years back there, as well as with Cuba and Venezuela. So any independent country, even Mexico, of course, the U.S. has had this hostility towards Mexico because Mexico will not privatize its national oil conglomerate, Pemex, basically. And it's keeping it very jealously as part of the Mexican state. So that's a reason enough for many in the U.S. oligarchy to demand intervention against Mexico. So all of the Latin American states, those that aren't completely enslaved already to the U.S. system, are under threat by this attack on Venezuela and by this renewed siege on Cuba. I believe Cuba will get through it, but it's going to go through a couple of years of hardship, basically. But fortunately, Cuba has friends, and Cuba has this foot in the door to the new BRICS bloc, which is the big hope for many, many countries, not just those under siege, and there's probably 20-odd countries under siege by the US now, but also all of the other countries like the ASEAN countries. All of the Southeast Asian countries are part of BRICS now because they know that the domination of the dollar is something that's been hurting their economies for many, many years, and they need some alternative.
Sure. Do you think also what happened in Venezuela in some ways has placed China more firmly behind Iran? Not only because China gets a lot of oil from Iran, and now it might need even more if Venezuelan oil is not available, but also because if USA is going to kind of have such an attitude in its own sphere of influence, then surely Russia and China are going to want to tighten up their own spheres of influence. So do you think that has impacted the politics between Iran and China?
Look, everything the US has been doing in recent decades has made that influence. You know, the Chinese saw this coming a long time ago. They joined the World Trade Organization. But they were concerned about, and the IMF World Bank, but they were concerned about the rig rules in the WTO, in the IMF World Bank. And of course, that led them to eventually to establishing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, basically. They saw that they were being excluded from their proper role in the world, given their weight in their economic weight in the world. And they've been creating these economic institutions. They created this Belt and Road Initiative specifically to avoid naval blockade by the US, although they haven't given up their naval capacity, of course. In fact, they're the biggest shipbuilders in the world these days, the Chinese. But you would have noticed probably that the rail link to Iran from China became active just recently, just in recent months, basically.
Yes.
Bypassing, going north of Afghanistan, going through Central Asia, because they still worried about the instability in the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. But even with Afghanistan, there was a better prospect of Chinese relations with the Afghans than it was under occupation. So now there is a direct rail link from the Chinese cities to Tehran. And the relationships, as you say, have strengthened between China and Iran. China is now possibly overtaking Russia as the major supplier of military technology to Iran. Iran has its own indigenous military technology in its missile systems and so on, and its air defense. But it's been getting air defense systems from China in recent times, some in recent days, basically, because it's got some weaknesses in its military capacity there. So China is also sharing intelligence with Iran. It's publishing even publicly information on US assets in the West Asian region, which Iran has promised to hit if the US attacks them again. So the relations between Iran, which is now a full member of BRICS too, and China have certainly strengthened in recent times. But Iran has always maintained this position of being, as far as possible, reliant on its own resources and its own technology. Nevertheless, as you say, it's supplying fuel to China. Iran has this very light oil. They call it sweet oil. I think something to do with the sulfur content as well as its lightness. It's easier to process. There are many countries that actually prefer Iranian oil, like South Korea, for example. South Korea, although it was very embedded in the US security network, basically, but it was a major importer of Iranian fuel until the US decided to blockade the funds. And there was some brief unfreezing of those funds a little while back. I'm not sure what's happening now. Possibly the current impasse has made Seoul reluctant to buy fuel, but they really preferred Iranian light crude for their petrochemical manufacturing business in South Korea, basically. So similarly, I believe that the Chinese, while they've been buying Venezuelan crude, it's a very heavy crude. It involves a slightly different process to refine the use of other components like naphtha, for example. The Iranians, by the way, provided naphtha to the Venezuelans to restart their own refineries a few years ago when the Venezuelan oil industry ground to a halt under the pressure of the economic blockade from the US. So all of these relationships, and of course, obviously, the Russia-China relationship, have strengthened enormously since the US has been blatantly trying to reimpose a dictatorship on all parts of the world. Really, that's the major driving force that has led many, many countries. In Iran itself, they talk about a resistance economy where they make a virtue out of not being able to access certain things. So they will develop their steel industry, for example, into an export industry, providing they used to import steel in Iran. No longer. They provide all their own iron and steel, and they began to export it to other countries, to African countries and so on. So that has happened precisely under the pressure of this sort of blockade. And the most notable one, of course, is the very close relationship, I would say unbreakable in the medium term, between Russia and China. But also now Iran has become, in many respects, the third most important regime within BRICS, basically, because it's the most demonized. Russia and China have their own demonizations from the U.S. in propaganda terms, blockades and economic siege measures and so on. But Iran has become the other very important protagonist within the BRICS bloc, basically. And it's because of this long-term pressure and attempts that the US eventually is going to exclude itself from the world economy. That's what the tables will flip, particularly if there's a serious crash in the dollar, which may be coming. The tables will flip and there'll be a great rush to China and Russia and to BRICS, as has already happened with, we've seen most of the global south is now either in the queue to get into BRICS or heading in that direction.
Tim, thank you so much. It's always a huge pleasure to speak with you, your wealth of knowledge. I guess in the next 1 or 2 days, let's see what happens when Netanyahu goes and visits Trump. But also, Tim, I'm so glad that you have written a book on Yemen, because you were one of the first kind of outsiders to go to Yemen. And at the time, I remember I was asking you definitely should write a book about that. So do please share a link. Yes. I'll put it on the show notes as well. And
Yemeni authors and about 4 or 5 non-Yemeni authors, but it's a compilation. So multiple.
Oh, brilliant.
I'll send you.
Yeah, I'd love to read it myself. I'll put a link to it as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for your time, and hopefully see you again soon. Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs.